The desperate failure of Tchaikovsky's marriage to Antonina Milyukova and of his attempted suicide left scars that would never heal and brought changes both to the man and to his music that would remain with him for the rest of his life. Tchaikovsky's marriage had been a hopeless attempt to provide an escape of some kind from the social consequences of his homosexuality. It reflected also his very real need of a close relationship with a woman to fill the void left by the loss of his mother. He felt doomed to eternal loneliness. But fate presented him with Nadezhda von Meck, and he was to find solace in his strange relationship with this unusual woman. Nadezhda von Meck was the widow of a railway developer who had died when she was 44, leaving her an extremely wealthy woman. She was clever and capable, played the piano with talent, and had admired Tchaikovsky's music for some time. Her first contact with the composer came in the form of a generous commission to write some pieces for her to play with Tchaikovsky's young friend, the violinist Josef Kotek. But following the collapse of Tchaikovsky's marriage, and in some degree because of it, the relationship steadily took on an increasing significance and was to play a major part in Tchaikovsky's further development. For the next 13 years, although they studiously avoided meeting, Nadezhda von Meck would guarantee Tchaikovsky the financial independence to devote himself entirely to composition. Perhaps even more significantly, she gave him, through a long and passionate correspondence, the support of an intimate confidant and an emotional focus which brought a measure of stability. All of these things contributed to an important change in Tchaikovsky's creative preoccupations. His identification with the fate of his young heroines begins to give way to an introspective concern with his own most intimate problems, and to the expression of his own fate through the symphonies, a concern that he was willing to share with his new confidant. I am now absorbed in a symphony which I began to compose as far back as last winter, and which I very much want to dedicate to you, because I think you will find in it echoes of your own innermost thoughts and feelings. But if having your name on the title page is disagreeable to you, then we can manage without it. Let you and I alone know to whom this symphony is dedicated. Von Meck replied immediately. Permit me to ask you one question. Do you consider me your friend? Since you have never once called me by that name, I do not know whether you acknowledge me as such. If in answer to my question you can say yes, then it would be extremely agreeable to me if you would set down on your symphony that you dedicate it to your friend, mentioning no name. Tchaikovsky responded to this demand for a more intimate relationship by writing across the title page of the manuscript score, dedicated to my best friend. He had found a seemingly perfect foil, and it drew from him a flood of the most intimately revealing declarations of his artistic intentions. In our symphony, there is a program. It is possible to express in words what it is trying to say. And to you, and only to you, I am able and willing to explain the meaning both of the whole and of the separate movements. Of course, I can do this only in a general way. The introduction is the seed of the whole symphony, undoubtedly the main idea. This is fate, that fateful force which prevents the impulse to happiness from obtaining its goal, which jealously ensures that peace and happiness shall not be complete and unclouded, which hangs over your head like the sword of Damocles, and unwaveringly, constantly poisons the soul. It is invincible. You will never overcome it. You can only reconcile yourself to it and languish fruitlessly. Tchaikovsky knew that his symphony was intensely biographical, and in answer to criticism from Sergei Taneyev that it was programmatic, he responded, "As for your observation that my symphony is programmatic, I completely agree. But the program is such that it cannot be formulated in words. Should not a symphony express everything for which there are no words, but which the soul wishes to express and requires to be expressed?" There is a striking contrast between Tchaikovsky's words to Taneyev and what he had already written to Nadezhda von Meck. He had picked up the emotional challenge in her invitation to call her his friend and matched it with an extravagant gesture of his own. This atmosphere of secrecy with a highly charged emotional undercurrent was to pervade the whole of their relationship. Although they never spoke and came face to face only once for just a moment and by accident, each was acutely conscious of the need for the other and expressed the need repeatedly in an increasingly intense correspondence, usually with von Meck setting the pace. "Perhaps I am not a person who is intimate with you, but you know how I love you, how I wish you all the best of everything. In my view, it is not blood and physical ties that give the right to this, but feelings and moral relationships between people. You know how many happy moments you afford me, how deeply grateful I am for them, and how necessary you are to me. Consequently, I am doing nothing for you, but everything for myself." The relationship had quickly taken on a peculiar intensity, no doubt fired by Tchaikovsky's dedication of the symphony and the program which he had sent. The cheerless and hopeless feeling grows yet stronger and more burning. Is it not better to turn away from reality and submerge yourself in daydreams? Oh, rejoice! There appears at the very least a sweet and gentle daydream. Some blissful, radiant human image hurries by and beckons you away. How good this is. How distant now sounds the obsessive first theme of the Allegro. Little by little, daydreams envelop the soul completely. There she is, happiness. No, they were but daydreams, and fate awakes you from them. And so all of life is an unbroken alternation of hard reality with swiftly passing dreams and visions of happiness. No haven exists. Drift upon that sea until it engulfs and submerges you in its depths. The Fourth Symphony was completed in January of 1878. Tchaikovsky had sought to express more of himself than he had ever dared before, and he had succeeded. But in addition, the process had forced him to broaden both the style and the content of what he was trying to say. The program which he had sent to Nadezhda von Meck was written after the event, and although it is a true piece of emotional biography, on rereading it, Tchaikovsky took fright and added a postscript to his letter, which is in some ways even more revealing. Just now, as I was about to place this letter in its envelope, I reread it and was horrified by the vagueness and inadequacy of the program which I am sending you. For the first time in my life, I have had to put into words and phrases musical thoughts and musical images. I have not succeeded in saying this as I ought. I was seriously depressed last winter when I was composing the symphony, and it serves as a true echo of what I was going through at the time. But it is merely an echo. How could it be translated into any clearly defined verbal form? I am certainly not able to do so. Also, I have already forgotten much. There have remained only general recollections of the strength and horror of the feelings which I experienced at the time. The shadow of those feelings was to remain with Tchaikovsky for a long time to come. The collapse of his marriage had taken its toll, and for the next 8 years he composed nothing that showed the same inspiration and personal commitment as he had given to the Fourth Symphony and Evgenia Onegin. And he knew it. He became depressed both about his career and about his creative powers, and began to feel that he had played himself out. For a long time, he composed nothing at all. Then, when he was in Italy in March of 1881, he learnt that Nikolai Rubinstein, who was to have joined him on his tour, had died in Paris. He went there immediately, full of anxieties at the prospect of seeing Rubinstein's lifeless body. Nikolai had always been the kinder of the two brothers, and Tchaikovsky had developed a great affection for him. He was touched by the loss, and it brought back something of the lost commitment. He wanted to write something intimate with an important piano part. And so when he returned to Italy, he began work on the piano trio, Opus 50, including a set of variations based on episodes in Rubinstein's life. He completed it in January of 1882 and dedicated it to the memory of a great artist. In November of that same year, when Tchaikovsky was 42, Mily Balakirev, who had played so important a role in the composition of Romeo and Juliet, and who had so much admired Francesca da Rimini, suggested Byron's Manfred as a subject for another symphonic poem. Tchaikovsky turned it down, but with revealing thoughts about his feelings of inadequacy. Despite my venerable age and my considerable experience in composing, I must confess that I am still wandering in the boundless field of composition, trying vainly to discover my true pathway. I feel that such a pathway does exist, and I know that once I find it, I shall hit upon where I ought to be going. From time to time, I've come close to that path, but this has happened only rarely, and in no way can I number Francesca and The Tempest among those few exceptions. These compositions of mine in no way recreate the given subject, but are only written apropos of it. That is to say, the kinship of the music and the program is not an inner one, but external and incidental. 2 years later, however, in November of 1884, the two men met in Moscow, and Balakirev, in a spirit of newfound religious fervor, demonstrated a concern and affection for Tchaikovsky which touched him deeply. He wrote to Balakirev on the following day. I was profoundly moved by our conversation of yesterday. How good you are. What a true friend you are to me. How I wish that that enlightenment which has come into your soul would also descend on me. Tchaikovsky had learned that his friend Joseph Kotek, who had made the introduction to Nadezhda von Meck, was dying of tuberculosis in Switzerland. And before going to see him, he bought a copy of Byron's Manfred to take on the journey. But it was not until June of the following year, more than 7 years after the completion of the Fourth Symphony, that he felt able to begin composition. Then he wrote to Sergei Taneyev. After some hesitation, I've decided to compose Manfred, because I feel that until I've fulfilled the promise which I imprudently gave Balakirev during the winter, I shall not be at ease. I don't know what will come out, and for the moment, I'm dissatisfied with myself. No, it's 1,000 times more pleasant to compose without a program. But then, as so often before, work drew him closer and closer to his subject. On the 1st of August, he wrote to Emilia Pavlovskaya, who had sung Tatiana in the premiere of Evgenia Onegin. Now I can't stop. The symphony is coming out gigantic, serious, difficult, absorbing all my time and sometimes wearying me in the extreme. But an inner voice tells me that I'm not laboring in vain, and that this will perhaps be the best of my symphonic compositions. For the first time, Tchaikovsky had begun to identify himself with the male figure in one of his works. He wrote again to Emilia Pavlovskaya, expressing the fear that he was turning into a Manfred himself. But despite the hopelessness of Byron's tale and his protagonist's despair, Tchaikovsky had found the key to something in his creativity which had long been submerged, and through it, his ability to express himself moved onto a new level. In the first movement, he produced the most committed music that he had written in 8 years, and the toughest and most masculine music that he had ever composed. He had set the scene in a revealing preface to the manuscript score. Manfred wanders in the Alps, tormented by hopeless longings and recollections of his guilty past. He suffers deep spiritual anguish and is torn by fatal questions of existence. Neither the sciences of the occult, nor the powers of darkness, nor anything in the world can afford him the forgetfulness which he seeks in vain. Memories of his ruined Astarte, whom once he had passionately loved, gnaw and eat at his heart. Nothing can remove the curse which weighs on his soul. There is no end to Manfred's boundless despair. The focal points of Tchaikovsky's identification with Manfred are not difficult to find. Solitude, gloom, and despair had all been constant companions since his childhood, as had the longing for forgetfulness and the idea of inescapable fate. But now, more particularly, Byron's hero is haunted by the guilt of unnatural love, the idea of incest, which had haunted Byron himself. In addition, there is once again the theme of the wronged woman. But this time she does not appear in person. Astarte exists only in the mind of her lover, haunting his memories in the most touching music that Tchaikovsky had written, since Tatiana had so stirred him 8 years before. On the 25th of September 1885, 5 months after he had begun, Tchaikovsky wrote to Balakirev, "I have carried out your wish. Manfred is finished. I think you will be somewhat displeased at the speed with which I have composed it, but I could not do otherwise. I've sat over Manfred, not getting up from my seat, I may say, for nearly 4 months, from the beginning of June until today. It was very hard work, but also very pleasant, especially when, having begun with some effort, I got carried away. Of course, I cannot predict whether the symphony will please you or not, but believe me, never in my life have I tried so hard and become so weary from my work. The piece is very difficult and demands a very large orchestra. Of course, Manfred is dedicated to you." I think it's my best symphonic work. But because of its difficulty, its impracticability and its complexity, it is doomed to failure and to be ignored. And so, with those despairing words, Tchaikovsky offered the score of Manfred to his publisher for no fee. Despite the references to the speed of composition in his letter to Balakirev, Tchaikovsky was conscious that he no longer worked at the same pace as before, and began again to express anxieties about being played out. More significantly, each of his major steps forward was now a hard-won battle in self-discovery that cost him dear and left him emotionally tired and full of doubt. He was at last beginning to enjoy public success, but because of the very nature of his personal quest, even this did little for his confidence in his own work. He was even convinced that Onegin was doomed to public failure, since it had been withdrawn from the repertoire. And all of this, in spite of recognizing quite clearly how much of himself he had succeeded in putting into it. He also found increasing difficulty with orchestration, which had always come so easily to him. And his old fear of inherent laziness began to trouble him seriously once again. Perhaps there are grounds for attributing to the Russian people a lack of fundamental creativity, for saying that the Russian is a lazy person par excellence. By nature he is talented, but by nature he suffers from a deficiency of willpower and from a lack of staying power. You have first to overcome yourself. But his successes had helped in some ways. Tchaikovsky had begun to feel more at ease with the world. And early in 1888, when he was 47, he made his first international conducting tour with considerable success. But even this soon lost its charm. And at the end of the tour, he wrote to his publisher, "I have expended a great deal of money and even more health and energy. In return, I have gained some celebrity, but every hour I ask myself why. Is it worthwhile? In the end, I come to the conclusion that it is far better to live quietly, without fame." In April, he moved to a new country house at Frolovskoye, just outside Klin. And in May, he wrote to Nadezhda. "It is indeed so beautiful that when I go out for a half-hour walk in the morning, I feel compelled to extend it to 2 hours. I have not yet begun work. To speak frankly, I feel as yet no impulse for creative work. Have I written myself out? No ideas, no inclinations." After 2 months of inactivity, he wrote to Nadezhda von Meck, "I am dreadfully anxious to prove, not only to others but also to myself, that I am not yet played out as a composer. Have I already told you that I intend to write a symphony? The beginning was difficult. Now, however, inspiration seems to have come. We shall see." In the Fourth Symphony, Tchaikovsky had attempted to challenge fate, as he felt Beethoven had done in his Fifth. And he had succeeded at least to some extent in brushing fate aside. Now, in a sketch for the first movement of his own Fifth Symphony, he suggests a mood of resignation and describes fate more gently as the workings of Providence. Introduction: complete resignation before fate, or, which is the same thing, before the inscrutable predestination of Providence. Allegro: murmurs, doubts, plaints, reproaches against X. Shall I throw myself into the embraces of faith? A wonderful program if only it can be fulfilled. Tchaikovsky's notes are no more than a preliminary sketch, but they do describe his mood. In any case, it is no longer possible to trace any sort of narrative in his music, as it had been with Romeo and Juliet or Francesca da Rimini. Tchaikovsky had traveled a long way since then. There is little doubt that X refers in some way to anguish over his homosexuality, and the idea of religious faith as the road to solace had appealed to him before. But despite the emotional need, he had never been able to commit himself in any meaningful way. Now, however, he does imply some confidence in ultimate clemency. If he was unable to find solace in faith, the idea of love as a redeeming force always remained with him. And in the second movement, he once again suggests the theme of love frustrated by fate or providence. But he no longer identifies himself with the sufferings of a heroine or hero. His quest has become one of self-discovery. Now he makes love his own, and in so doing, he makes it universal. In the manuscript score, he wrote above the horn theme, "Oh que je t'aime, oh mon ami." You ask, my friend, have I known a love that was not platonic? Yes and no. If the question is phrased differently, have I experienced complete happiness in love? Then I will reply, no, no, and no. But I believe that the answer to that question is in my music. If you ask me, do I understand the omnipotence, the boundless force of that feeling? Then I will reply yes, yes, and yes. And again I'll say that I have, with love, endeavored repeatedly to express in music the torment and at the same time the bliss of love. I do not know whether I have succeeded. I must leave that to others to decide. On the 19th of August, 1888, when he was 48, Tchaikovsky wrote to Nadezhda von Meck, "Now that the symphony is nearing its end, I regard it more objectively than at the height of my work on it, and I can say that it is, praise be to God, no worse than its predecessors. This knowledge is very sweet to me." But his self-criticism was developing all the time. By December, his spirit had failed, and what he wrote this time tells us more about his earnestness than about his music. After 2 performances of my new symphony in St. Petersburg and another in Prague, I have come to the conclusion that it is a failure. There is something repellent about it, an insincerity and artificiality. The public instinctively recognizes this, and it was very clear to me that the ovations which I received were directed at my previous work. The realization of all this causes me acute and agonizing dissatisfaction with myself. Am I really played out, as they say? Can I now only repeat and imitate my former style? Last night, I looked through the 4th Symphony, our symphony. What a difference! How immeasurably superior it is. This is sad, very sad. 2 years later, on the 4th of October 1890, he received a letter from Nadezhda von Meck announcing that she was on the verge of bankruptcy and that she would have to break off both the annuity and the friendship. Goodbye, my dear incomparable friend. Remember me sometimes, and do not forget one whose love for you is infinite. With those sentimental words, Tchaikovsky lost not only his benefactress, but his most intimate confidant. After his mother, Nadezhda von Meck had meant more to him than anyone else in his life. She had fulfilled an essential need created by the loss of his mother, shared his innermost thoughts and the progress of his music through the years of his greatest development. She had become an integral part of his spiritual and creative life. When Tchaikovsky discovered that the threat of bankruptcy was unreal, and that in spite of his offers to begin repaying the subsidy, his friend and patron was unwilling to continue the friendship, it dealt him a blow from which he would not recover during the remaining 3 years of his life. From very early on, Tchaikovsky had felt that the relationship had transcended its material dimensions, as indeed it had done. So what happened to end it attacked an essential part of his faith, both in himself and in human nature. And its irony is heightened by the fact that he never discovered what lay behind it, and therefore could never begin to understand. Nadezhda von Meck was both physically ill with tuberculosis and emotionally under severe pressures from her children. Perhaps also with a sense of guilt that her charity had been misdirected through self-interest. She was a passionate woman and no stranger to guilt. An early sexual infidelity had killed her husband and given her an illegitimate child, an event for which she was being blackmailed even at this late stage of her life. To make matters worse, Tchaikovsky could not adequately express his own hurt, for fear of hurting in turn someone who had given him so much and for whom he had such affection. He felt abandoned and became painfully aware of the real depth of his dependence and of his affection. Tchaikovsky was only 50, but he had begun to age rapidly. Nevertheless, he plunged himself repeatedly into feverish activity. His friends found him changed and noted both his age and a melancholy bordering on bitterness. He was saddened also by the deaths of many of his friends, including those of Nikolai Rubinstein, Joseph Kotek, and his sister Alexandra. He became increasingly preoccupied with the idea of death, which he referred to as that snub-nosed horror. Even success brought little solace. He had become, after Tolstoy, the most respected Russian artist of his age, with a degree of success given to few composers in their lifetime. But he felt that it was for past achievements, and since his artistic quest meant so much to him, that was not enough. His concern was always to move forward, and therefore for the success of his latest work. In this, he was generally disappointed with his best music all through his life, precisely because he had succeeded in breaking new ground, and felt that neither he nor the public knew how to judge it. He remained acutely self-critical. If I become convinced that I can only serve reheated dishes at my musical banquet, then I shall certainly give up composing. A hoary old man should either go forward. Verdi, for instance, goes on developing at 80, or else remain on the heights that he has already reached. Not for anything in the world do I want to go on dirtying paper when everything else has long since failed. In 1892, He set to work on a new symphony, but with little conviction. He wrote from Berlin that he was thinking of abandoning the project, but still needed to work because he could not forget composition, and anyway, needed something to help him occupy his time. By the end of the year, however, he had given up entirely with these words: "There is nothing in the least interesting or attractive about it. I have decided to throw it out and forget about it. I am delighted to have come to this irrevocable decision." He continued his tour, and on New Year's Day, 1893, he visited his beloved Fanny Durbach at her home in France. He had not seen her for more than 40 years. I knew her at once, and although she is now 70, she is little changed. I was very much afraid that there would be tears and a scene, but nothing of the sort took place. She greeted me as though it was only a year since we had met, with joy, tenderness, and quite simply. Then she showed me our exercise books, and most interesting of all, some wonderfully dear letters of Mamma. The past rose up clearly before me, and I seemed to breathe the air of Votkinsk and to hear the voice of Mamma. He continued his tour with mounting success, but wrote to Modeste: "What I need is to believe in myself again. My faith in myself is terribly shattered, and it seems to me that my role has ended." Tchaikovsky was to find that belief only once again, and it brought with it his greatest single step forward and his masterpiece. O Lord, I thank Thee. Today, 24th of March, completed preliminary sketch well. During my journey, the idea for another symphony presented itself to me. This time with a program, but of a kind that will remain an enigma to all. It will just be called Program Symphony, number 6. It is shot through with subjective feeling, and while I was composing it in my mind during my travels, I often wept a great deal. Now that I am back, I have settled down to writing the sketches, and the work is proceeding so intensively that in less than 4 days, the first movement is completely ready and the others clearly outlined in my head. There will be many formal innovations, among which the finale will not be a noisy allegro, but on the contrary, a long drawn-out adagio. You cannot imagine what bliss I feel in the conviction that my time is not yet over and that work is still possible. Of course, I may be wrong, but I don't think so. The ultimate essence of the symphony's plan is life. First movement, all impulsive passion, confidence, thirst for activity, must be short. Second movement, love. Third, disappointments. Finale, death. Result of collapse, ends dying away. Must also be short. Tchaikovsky had embarked on the most innovative and the most dramatic of all his works. Perhaps for the first time, he addressed the central emotional problem of his life full square, and in so doing, he succeeded in relating musical material and emotional idea more closely than he had ever done before. All the problems of organization and structure which had so worried him in the past seem finally to be resolved. At the same time, he expresses more clearly than ever before the anguish of love and the unhappiness of a passionate and gentle nature doomed to frustration and seemingly eternal loneliness. Although the composition of the Sixth Symphony was done in 7 weeks, Tchaikovsky did not hurry into finishing the scoring. He had had increasing difficulty with orchestration, and so he now allowed his ideas to ripen in his mind before committing them to paper. He knew also that he was writing his greatest work, and was quite conscious of the fact that in some way he had been confronting death. He was elated with his progress, but the underlying turmoil remained. He suffered from physical pains and mental torments which he could not put into words, but which he felt he was expressing in his symphony. In this mood, he received a set of poems from a young student named Daniil Rathaus, and he promptly composed the 6 songs, opus 73. The last of them, and Tchaikovsky's last song, might well have been written for him. Again, as before, I'm alone. Again I am gripped by despair. The poplar looks in at the window, bathed in moonlight. The poplar looks in at the window. Its leaves whisper something to me, and heaven's ablaze with stars. Where are you now, my love? I cannot begin to convey all that is happening now. Pray for me, as I now pray for you. On the 1st of August, 1893, at his new home in Klin, Tchaikovsky set to work on the final details of the Sixth Symphony. But 2 days later, he wrote to Nadezhda. The further I get with the instrumentation, the more difficulty it causes me. 20 years ago, I rushed along with full speed without giving it a thought, and it turned out well. Now I have become timid and unsure of myself. I have just spent the entire day sitting over 2 pages. Nothing really turns out as I'd like it to. But the work is progressing all the same. A fortnight later, he wrote to his favorite nephew, Bob Davidoff. I shall find it neither unusual nor surprising if this symphony is torn to pieces or little appreciated. But I definitely consider it the best, and especially the most sincere of all my works. I love it as I have never loved any other of my musical offspring. On the same day, he wrote to his brother Anatoly. The comparative slowness of the orchestration has not been caused by a deterioration in my powers. It was the result of my having become a great deal stricter with myself. I am very proud of this symphony. I think it is the best of my compositions. By the 1st of September, the work was complete. It was Tchaikovsky's moment of greatest triumph. He knew that he had written his finest work, and more than that, he had come to terms with the obsession that had haunted him all his life, in the only way possible, by recognition and acceptance. Tchaikovsky knew what he had done, but what he did not know was that fate, which had so preoccupied him for so long, was about to overtake him finally. He had written his own requiem. In the first movement, he quotes the Russian burial hymn, and the finale is a lamenting farewell, with an inevitable descent into eternal darkness. Tchaikovsky conducted the first performance of his Sixth Symphony in St. Petersburg on the 28th of October, 1893. It was not liked, but for the first time, that did not trouble him. At the very moment of his greatest achievement, his spirit and his febrile imagination had sunk so low that he could be brought to suicide by one-time school friends seeking to protect their school from homosexual scandal. Within a week of the premiere, Tchaikovsky was summoned to a court of honor, convened by important men of the state, who had once been his friends at the School of Jurisprudence. A few days later, on the 6th of November 1893, at 3 o'clock in the morning, Piotr Ilich Tchaikovsky, aged 53, died of poison, procured for him by his important friends and taken at their insistence.